Springville, Texas, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nestled between rolling hills and sprawling fields, it had a charm that belied its underlying restlessness. The Mitchell family was a fixture in this small community, and their lives seemed as predictable as the Texas sunsets. Laura Mitchell was 18, a senior at Springville High School. With her long brown hair often pulled into a neat ponytail and a perpetual look of determination in her hazel eyes, she appeared to be the very model of a dutiful daughter. She was bright, having been accepted into several prestigious colleges, and her mother, Karen Mitchell, took immense pride in her academic achievements. Karen, at 45, was a local school teacher, known for her strict but fair demeanor. She had always been focused on ensuring Laura's success, sometimes to the detriment of their relationship. Karen's expectations were high, and she had meticulously planned Laura's future, envisioning her daughter at an Ivy League university. However, despite the outward appearance of a perfect life, there was a growing sense of dissatisfaction gnawing at Laura. Springville, with its unchanging rhythms and close-knit society, felt stifling. Laura yearned for a life beyond the town's borders, one filled with opportunities and experiences that seemed so distant from her current reality. Her dreams of leaving for college were tinged with a sense of both hope and dread as she grappled with the pressure to conform to her mother's plans. The Mitchells lived next door to Mr. Harold Brooks, an elderly widower of 68. Mr. Brooks had recently moved to Springville after retiring from a long career as a history professor. With his thin silver hair and neatly trimmed beard, he was a figure of quiet dignity. Despite his age, he possessed a sharp mind and an air of understated charm. His home was filled with old books and historical artifacts, reflecting his lifelong passion for history. Mr. Brooks had been something of an enigma to the townsfolk. He kept to himself and rarely ventured out except for his solitary walks and occasional visits to the local library. His presence was a subtle reminder of the past, and while he had not yet fully integrated into the community, he was respected for his erudition. Laura first encountered Mr. Brooks on one of her routine walks through the neighborhood. She had noticed him sitting on his porch, engrossed in a book, and their first conversation had been about literature. Mr. Brooks had an effortless way of discussing complex topics with a warmth that Laura found comforting. Their conversations soon became a regular occurrence, providing Laura with a rare escape from her everyday frustrations. One crisp autumn afternoon, Laura walked past Mr. Brooks' house, her mind preoccupied with the latest argument she had had with her mother. Karen had criticized Laura's choice of electives, insisting she focus solely on subjects that would bolster her college applications. Laura, feeling the weight of her mother's expectations, found solace in her interactions with Mr. Brooks. He had invited her to his home for tea and a discussion on a book she had mentioned during one of their conversations. Entering Mr. Brooks' home for the first time, Laura was struck by its old-world charm. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes on history, philosophy, and literature. The room had an air of quiet sophistication, and the aroma of freshly brewed tea mingled with the scent of old paper. Laura felt a sense of comfort she hadn't experienced in a long time. Mr. Brooks poured the tea with practiced grace, and they settled into armchairs by the fireplace. Their conversation flowed easily, shifting from classic literature to personal reflections. Laura found herself opening up to Mr. Brooks in ways she hadn't with anyone else. He listened attentively, his insightful questions and thoughtful responses creating a space where Laura felt valued and understood. As the weeks passed, their meetings became more frequent. Laura continued to visit Mr. Brooks under the pretense of discussing literature, but their relationship began to transcend these initial boundaries. Mr. Brooks became a confidant, someone Laura could talk to about her frustrations and dreams. The intellectual connection they shared gradually evolved into a deeper emotional bond. Karen, on the other hand, was increasingly concerned about Laura's frequent absences. She had noticed her daughter's changing demeanor. Laura seemed more withdrawn and distracted. When Karen discovered that Laura had been spending a considerable amount of time with Mr. Brooks, her concerns grew. She had heard rumors about Mr. Brooks being a recluse and had been wary of him from the beginning. Her protective instincts kicked in, and she began to question Laura about her visits. Laura, feeling the pressure from her mother's interrogations, tried to brush off Karen's concerns. She insisted that her time with Mr. Brooks was merely academic, but the tension between mother and daughter intensified. Karen's probing questions and demands for details became a source of constant friction in their home. Unbeknownst to Karen, the relationship between Laura and Mr. Brooks had begun to cross boundaries. They had started to share more intimate aspects of their lives, and their emotional connection grew stronger. Laura found solace in Mr. Brooks' company, away from the controlling grasp of her mother. Mr. Brooks, in turn, felt a renewed sense of purpose in guiding and supporting Laura. Their bond, initially intellectual, had taken on a romantic dimension, driven by their mutual need for understanding and connection. As the autumn days grew shorter and the town prepared for the approaching holiday season, the facade of normalcy in the Mitchell household began to crack. Laura's secret meetings with Mr. Brooks continued to intensify, and their growing affection for each other became harder to conceal. The seemingly tranquil life of Springville was on the brink of upheaval, setting the stage for a dramatic shift that would test the limits of their relationships and the strength of their resolve. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and the once predictable life of the Mitchells was about to unravel in ways that none could have anticipated. The balance of their lives was delicately poised, and the arrival of Mr. Brooks as a catalyst for change marked the beginning of a tumultuous journey that would alter their lives forever. The transition from autumn to winter in Springville brought a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the town. The once vibrant leaves had given way to bare branches and frost-covered lawns. For Laura Mitchell and Mr. Harold Brooks, this change in season mirrored the deepening complexity of their secret relationship. As their clandestine meetings became more frequent, Laura and Mr. Brooks found solace in each other's company. Their intellectual discussions had evolved into intimate conversations about their personal lives and dreams. The emotional connection between them had grown into a profound, albeit forbidden, romance. Laura felt an exhilarating sense of freedom in Mr. Brooks' presence, a stark contrast to the constraints imposed by her mother and the monotony of her small-town life. However, this newfound joy was overshadowed by the mounting pressure of keeping their relationship a secret. The burden of deception began to weigh heavily on both of them, fueling a sense of paranoia and fear of discovery. Mr. Brooks, whose initial calm demeanor had masked a more intense and obsessive nature, started to become increasingly nervous about the possibility of their affair being exposed. One chilly December evening, Laura and Mr. Brooks were alone in his study, discussing a novel that had become a metaphor for their own lives. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls filled with books. As they sat close together, their conversation turned to more personal matters. "I have been thinking," Mr. Brooks began, his voice tinged with unease, "about how precarious our situation is. Every time someone comes close to finding out, it's like a weight pressing down on me." Laura, sensing his anxiety, reached out and placed her hand on his. "We'll manage, Harold. We just have to be careful. As long as we keep this between us, everything will be fine." Despite her reassuring words, Laura felt a knot of worry in her own stomach. The secrecy of their relationship, once thrilling, was now a source of constant stress. The fear of discovery was compounded by Karen Mitchell's growing suspicions. Karen's frequent questions about Laura's whereabouts and the terse exchanges between mother and daughter had created a tense atmosphere at home. One evening, as Laura returned from one of her visits to Mr. Brooks, she found her mother waiting for her at the front door. Karen's eyes were sharp and her voice carried an edge of irritation. "Laura, where have you been?" Karen demanded. "I've been trying to reach you for hours." Laura, caught off guard, struggled to come up with a plausible excuse. "I was at the library, Mom. I lost track of time." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You've been spending an awful lot of time at that old man's house. What exactly are you doing there?" Laura felt a pang of frustration. "I told you we're just talking about books. I need to go now." Karen's expression hardened, but she said no more. The confrontation left Laura shaken, her resolve to keep her relationship with Mr. Brooks hidden becoming more strained. She knew that any further slip-ups could jeopardize everything. The strain on Mr. Brooks and Laura's relationship was further exacerbated when they almost got caught during one of their meetings. Laura had stayed later than usual, and as she was leaving, she accidentally knocked over a vase in Mr. Brooks' study. The sound was loud enough to alert his elderly neighbor, who lived across the street. Panic set in as Mr. Brooks and Laura scrambled to clean up the mess. Mr. Brooks hurriedly ushered Laura out the back door, and they managed to avoid any direct confrontation with the neighbor. The incident, however, left them both on edge, their paranoia intensifying with each close call. Laura's anxiety was compounded by her mother's increasing scrutiny. Karen had begun to check Laura's phone records and questioned her friends about her whereabouts. Laura felt trapped in a web of deceit and lies, struggling to maintain the illusion of normalcy while hiding the truth of her relationship with Mr. Brooks. Despite the tension, Laura and Mr. Brooks continued their secret meetings. Their affection for each other grew deeper, but so did their sense of isolation. They were caught in a cycle of secrecy and fear, their once innocent connection now overshadowed by the consequences of their choices. One frigid evening in December, Laura arrived at Mr. Brooks' home to find him in a particularly agitated state. He had been pacing the floor, his face etched with worry. "I can't keep doing this, Laura," he confessed, his voice trembling. "Every time I hear a car or see someone passing by, I'm terrified that we'll be discovered." Laura, feeling the weight of his anxiety, tried to offer comfort. "We just have to be careful. We'll get through this, I promise." But the reassurance she offered was as fragile as the promises they made to each other. The pressure of maintaining their secret began to erode the stability of their relationship. Mr. Brooks' increasing paranoia led him to take more drastic measures to ensure their privacy. He started to avoid certain routines and made changes to his home to make their meetings less noticeable. The emotional toll of their affair began to manifest in erratic behavior. Mr. Brooks became more possessive and demanding, his jealousy simmering beneath the surface. He would sometimes confront Laura with questions about her interactions with other people, driven by an irrational fear of losing her. Laura, in turn, became more withdrawn and defensive, caught between her love for Mr. Brooks and her desire to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her life. As Christmas approached, the festive spirit in Springville seemed at odds with the growing tension in Laura and Mr. Brooks' lives. The town was decorated with twinkling lights and cheerful ornaments, but for Laura, the holiday season felt like an oppressive reminder of the life she was trying to escape. Laura's relationship with her mother deteriorated further as Karen's suspicions grew. The constant arguments and demands for explanations created a rift between them. Laura, feeling increasingly cornered, began to lash out in frustration. The strain of her double life took a toll on her mental and emotional well-being. On the night before Christmas Eve, Laura had one of her most intense arguments with her mother. Karen had discovered a series of missed calls from Mr. Brooks on Laura's phone and confronted her with a fury that left Laura feeling raw and exposed. "What is going on with you and that man?" Karen demanded. "I know something is not right. You need to tell me the truth." Laura, overwhelmed by the pressure, snapped, "You wouldn't understand, Mom. Just stay out of my life for once." The argument ended with Laura storming out of the house, heading to Mr. Brooks' home in a fit of anger. She arrived to find Mr. Brooks waiting for her, his concern evident. "I'm sorry," Laura said, her voice trembling. "Things are falling apart. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Mr. Brooks, though sympathetic, was also fraught with his own turmoil. His attempts to calm Laura were tinged with his own fears and frustrations. Their emotional exchanges grew more intense, with both of them struggling to cope with the overwhelming pressure of their situation. The Christmas season, once a time of joy and celebration, had become a backdrop for their escalating conflict and emotional strain. The warmth of the holiday lights did little to dispel the cold shadow of their clandestine relationship. As the year drew to a close, the unresolved tensions between Laura and Mr. Brooks threatened to reach a breaking point. Their once secret meetings were now fraught with a sense of impending disaster. The fear of discovery loomed large, and the emotional toll of their affair began to manifest in their interactions. The fragile veneer of their happiness was beginning to crack, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow. The growing rift between Laura and Mr. Brooks, compounded by the pressure of maintaining their secret, created a volatile mix of emotions and actions. The consequences of their choices were becoming increasingly apparent, and the looming threat of exposure cast a long shadow over their lives. The calm before the storm had passed, and the storm itself was gathering force, ready to break with devastating impact. The days leading up to New Year's Eve in Springville were marked by a bitter cold that seemed to freeze the town in a state of uneasy anticipation. The festive decorations adorning the houses and storefronts stood in stark contrast to the turmoil that had been brewing in the Mitchell household and next door at Mr. Brooks' home. For Laura Mitchell and Mr. Harold Brooks, the end of the year brought with it a crescendo of tension and secrecy that was about to reach a dramatic and tragic climax. The fallout from Laura and Mr. Brooks' clandestine relationship had begun to take its toll. Their once innocent meetings had become fraught with paranoia and suspicion. Mr. Brooks' obsession with protecting their secret had grown more consuming, and Laura felt increasingly trapped by the weight of their deception. The joy of their connection was now overshadowed by the fear of discovery and the strain it placed on their lives. One particularly frigid evening, Laura arrived at Mr. Brooks' house with a heavy heart. The air inside was stifling despite the chill outside, and Mr. Brooks greeted her with a strained smile. They had planned to spend the evening discussing their future and finding solace in each other's company, but the tension between them was palpable. "I have been thinking," Mr. Brooks said, his voice low and anxious, "about how close we come to being discovered. Every time someone passes by, I can't help but worry that our secret will be revealed." Laura, trying to maintain a sense of calm, replied, "We've managed this long, haven't we? We just need to be more careful. I don't want to think about the possibility of anyone finding out." The conversation was tinged with a sense of dread, as both of them were acutely aware of the precariousness of their situation. Mr. Brooks had begun to exhibit erratic behavior, his anxiety manifesting in compulsive actions to ensure their privacy. He had started to make significant changes around his home, such as installing heavier curtains and changing the locks on the doors, all in an attempt to create a secure haven. Their discussion was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. The sound was jarring, and both Laura and Mr. Brooks exchanged worried glances. Mr. Brooks, visibly shaken, quickly moved to answer the door. To their relief, it was only a delivery person bringing a package. However, the incident served as a stark reminder of how fragile their secrecy had become. Laura's visits were becoming increasingly risky, and Mr. Brooks' mounting paranoia was starting to affect their interactions. The fear of being caught was palpable, and their once passionate exchanges had turned into tense and guarded conversations. As the new year approached, Laura's relationship with her mother had deteriorated further. Karen's suspicions had led her to take more drastic measures, including hiring a private investigator to follow Laura. Karen's determination to uncover the truth created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and tension in the Mitchell household. On New Year's Eve, Laura and Mr. Brooks had planned to spend the evening together, away from the prying eyes of the town. They chose to meet in Mr. Brooks' study, a place that had become their sanctuary amidst the chaos. The room was decorated with a few festive trinkets, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken anxieties. Laura arrived at Mr. Brooks' home in a state of agitation. She had had a particularly contentious argument with her mother earlier that day, which had left her feeling raw and vulnerable. Mr. Brooks, sensing her distress, tried to offer comfort, but his own fears and frustrations were evident. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Laura confessed, her voice trembling. "Everything is falling apart. My mother is more suspicious than ever, and I'm afraid of what might happen if she finds out." Mr. Brooks, his own anxiety mounting, attempted to reassure her. "We just need to stay calm and focused. We can get through this. Let's enjoy our last moments together before the new year. We can start fresh in the new year." Despite his attempts to calm Laura, Mr. Brooks' behavior had become increasingly erratic. His paranoia had reached a boiling point, and his fear of exposure had driven him to take more drastic measures. He had started to isolate himself from the rest of the world, and his interactions with Laura had become more intense and obsessive. As the evening wore on, the tension between them reached a breaking point. The slightest sound, such as a creaking floorboard or the distant sound of a car, would send Mr. Brooks into a fit of agitation. Laura, feeling the weight of his anxiety, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the fear of discovery was overwhelming. At the stroke of midnight, as the town celebrated the arrival of the new year with fireworks and cheers, Laura and Mr. Brooks were alone in the study. The room was dimly lit by the flickering light of a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. The festive atmosphere outside seemed a world away from the tension and dread that filled the room. In a moment of heightened emotion, Mr. Brooks' anxiety reached a fever pitch. He began to accuse Laura of not being committed to their relationship, his voice rising in anger and frustration. Laura, overwhelmed by the situation, tried to calm him down, but his rage was uncontrollable. "I'm doing everything I can to keep us safe," Mr. Brooks shouted, his face flushed with anger. "You don't understand how hard this is for me," Laura, taken aback by his sudden outburst, attempted to defuse the situation. "Harold, please calm down. We need to stay rational. This isn't helping." In the midst of their argument, Mr. Brooks, in a moment of blind fury, grabbed a nearby object, a heavy crystal paperweight, and hurled it across the room. The paperweight shattered against the wall, and the sound of the impact was deafening. In the chaos that followed, Laura stumbled backward, her hands flying up to shield herself. The intense emotions of the moment, combined with Mr. Brooks' mounting paranoia, created a volatile mix. In a tragic twist, as Laura tried to regain her balance, she accidentally collided with Mr. Brooks, causing him to lose his grip on the paperweight. The paperweight struck Laura on the head with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Mr. Brooks, realizing what had happened, was consumed with horror and disbelief. He rushed to Laura's side, but it was too late. Her life had been extinguished in an instant. Panic and remorse overwhelmed Mr. Brooks. He knew that Laura's death would have devastating consequences, and the weight of his actions was crushing. He quickly tried to clean up the scene, hiding the evidence and attempting to cover up the incident as best he could. As the hours passed, Mr. Brooks was left alone with his grief and guilt. He knew that the truth would eventually come out, and the thought of facing the consequences of his actions was unbearable. In a desperate attempt to escape the reality of what he had done, Mr. Brooks fled from the scene, leaving behind a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. The discovery of Laura's body the next morning sent shockwaves through Springville. The police were called to the scene, and the investigation quickly revealed the details of the tragic event. The town was thrown into turmoil as the shocking truth about Laura's death emerged. As the investigation unfolded, the police discovered evidence of Mr. Brooks' involvement in Laura's death. The broken paperweight and the traces of blood left behind provided damning clues. The detectives pieced together the events leading up to the incident, and the sordid details of Laura and Mr. Brooks' relationship came to light. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with the small town of Springville serving as the backdrop for a dramatic courtroom drama. The details of the forbidden relationship and the tragic outcome were laid bare for all to see. Mr. Brooks was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to prison. The aftermath of Laura's death left a profound impact on everyone involved. Karen Mitchell was devastated by the loss of her daughter and the revelations about her secret life. The community struggled to come to terms with the tragedy and the consequences of hidden desires and actions. As the new year began, Springville was forever changed by the events of that fateful night. The town, once filled with festive cheer, now bore the scars of a tragic and heartbreaking story. The lives of those involved had been irrevocably altered, and the lessons of the past served as a somber reminder of the cost of secrecy and the destructive power of unchecked emotions. The chapter closed with a sense of somber reflection and the haunting echoes of a love that had turned deadly. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a landscape of shattered lives and unfulfilled promises.